All right, and I know that you and Chuck, you have a lot in common with the investigation of the assassination of Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
Speak to that and Chuck's point of view over other researchers and where he differs from other researchers on the Kennedy assassination.
I think one of the big differences, and one of the reasons why I enjoy doing shows with Chuck, covering the Kennedy assassinations, whether JFK or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King's assassination, is that he is willing to accept evidence from anyone who has it that can be verified. And I'm a big evidence person. I try not to do anything without some substantial evidence of what we're discussing. And I think that's very important. I think a lot of times, Chuck often tells the 9/11 community to pay attention to the JFK community and how it developed because they would be facing the same problems. And that's still going on now. There are people, unfortunately, in a lot of the alternative media who want to use a story for some sort of personal gain, whether it's financial or brings them more fame or more infamy, rather than actually trying to progress the matter. That doing real research and bringing real evidence that can be verified is important, and talk is cheap. And unfortunately, there's a lot of talk going on and not enough research and, discussion and debate over evidence without any emotional attachment. I think that's another big thing too, is that while Chuck is passionate about what he does, he, like I, does not let himself become emotionally attached to details about the case, and rather goes for how much evidence is there for something, how much evidence does not exist, and then make a decision based on that rationally rather than, an emotional charge off into what you want to be true.
All right. Now, obviously, whenever he got into, I guess, the public eye, he was very well known for the JFK, being the blind JFK researcher. That's his kind of what he's known for.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, he covers a lot more on his show, but there was a particular network that he was on where a lot of the listeners and his co-anchors thought that the Kennedy assassination, that event in our country's history, was kind of moot at this point, and he should really just get the fuck off of it. That it's not important. Who cares? Why is it? Now, I personally am a younger guy, so I know and realize the importance of the event. But do you think that the event is still as relevant as, say, 9/11, which I know that you probably do, and why it's important for that issue to remain fresh and current in the American eyes, the American people's eyes?
Well, I think now most of all, with the election of a president who's not popular with a large portion of the country, that people are seeing the repetition of history. They're seeing that we are almost in now a pseudo 1960s where you have very divisive politics going on. You have the left and the right totally divided, and you have people as famous as Madonna, who claimed at one of the rally speeches that she had thought about blowing up the White House.
Yes.
You have people using the same rhetoric that was used in Kennedy's time. And I don't want to see us repeat history again. I don't want to ever see an American president assassinated while I'm alive. And if people forget the lessons of the past, then history is going to repeat itself. And if we don't combat, using the knowledge that we've gained from the Kennedy assassination, from the events that led up to it and the aftermath, then we're just going to see its repetition. And I think that it's our responsibility to pay attention to history and to learn from it. Because if we don't have any guide, someone actually asked me this yesterday when they were talking about the same thing that you suggested, that a lot of people think that, it's a moot point and it's no longer important. Well, no, it is important, because if we don't have any guide from history, we're just going to keep making mistakes over and over and over. And if we don't use the details, and just from the conversations I've had with Chuck, I know that we can demonstrate that there were several extra-legal cover-ups that happened. Not necessarily to hide the Kennedy assassination, but there were other illegal activities officials were doing around the Kennedy assassination that they never wanted released. So that's something we've learned, and it shows us that officials are not beyond breaking the law when it serves the purposes.
And what level or what level of importance do you feel that Chuck is giving to make sure that the JFK situation stays current? Do you believe he's a very integral person at this point in history?
Yeah, I think Chuck is an important voice, and I think he helps other voices, bring their evidence and bring their ideas to the case, which I think, unfortunately, a lot of times, I'm sure you've seen this in other, communities and advocacy groups, that it turns into politics a lot of times, and it turns into personal attacks rather than discussing the case. A lot of people would rather discuss the people who are researching the case rather than the case itself. And
Right.
I think that's a distraction. I think that officials try to decry anyone who goes against the official story, but you also have conspiracy advocates trying to do the exact same thing, personal attacks on people who support the official story, but not actually go after why they're wrong.
Right. Give me the nutshell from your point of view. Who's responsible for Kennedy's assassination and why?
Wow. Well, like I said, that's quite a question. A lot of people, will just come out and give you names. I don't think we're at a definitive name state yet. I think that a lot of people have suggested that there are people responsible, but the accompanying substantial evidence usually isn't there that I've seen. And I think what I did in my book and what I try to do, in discussing the matter is I think that there are probable scenarios that we can lay down, and I've even input names in my book for who these possible people could be, people that resemble that type of modus operandi that they would use. But I think that what I currently would support is perhaps the most feasible is a conglomerate plot, which I think it has to be small and compartmentalized. And I've gone over tens of thousands of CIA pages, and I've read their guides on how the development of such a plot would occur, and it needs to be small. Otherwise, it's going to be exposed. So I would say it doesn't take, a lot of people want dozens of people. That doesn't work. Someone's going to talk. Someone's going to get scared and expose the plot. So I would say that it's less than 10 people. I would say that, and it could even be as few as 4 or 5, because you really only need the integral parts of the plot. You need a shooter or shooters. You need the conspirators, 1 or 2, maybe 3, who are highly placed in different organizations that can aid the conspiracy to occur. And then you need a patsy. You need someone to take the blame. And it does, and a lot of people, they want to say that Lee Harvey Oswald is either 100% innocent or 100% guilty. And I find that he'd probably be in the middle. I think that he could have been involved in a plot, but I don't think that he knew that the ultimate goal of the plot was to kill President Kennedy.
Okay. Why? Why did it happen? Was it Vietnam? Was it the rumors about the Federal Reserve? What was it?
Well, I think there's a lot of unfortunate speculation that has occurred. I think Vietnam definitely could have been one of the motivating factors. I think another large factor that some people might overlook is the Bay of Pigs, because Kennedy was perceived by a lot of militants and by a lot of Cuban exile leaders and a lot of ornery officials that he had failed, the exile movement, by not sending in air support to help with the Bay of Pigs. And ultimately the Bay of Pigs was defeated because they couldn't hold the territory that they were trying to claim in Cuba. And they couldn't, what a lot of people don't know is that members of the CIA were actually trying to talk against the Bay of Pigs because there was no support for it in Cuba itself. There was very minimal support on the ground for an overthrow of Castro. So they were doomed to fail. There was, and I think that after people were taken prisoner and then, they had to be negotiated, the Castro government negotiated with the U.S. government to get them back, there was a lot of people who became disillusioned and angry at Kennedy. And Kennedy made promises to these people that he couldn't keep. He told them that they would one day sit in a free Havana, and that's just not the case. Castro died of old age, which is crazy. It's crazy. I mean, with the amount of people trying to kill him, the United States government was working with mafia leaders in 1960, and in 1961 they were working, like Sam Giancana and Santos Traficante and Johnny Roselli, and they were working with, Cuban Cuban exiles like Tony Verona and Manuel Artime, who are violent men. These are men who, if they perceive that you have mistreated them and they perceive that you use them, then they're going to want some revenge.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to want to see the person who they were deceived by punished for their deception. So that's where I think you start to get the motivations of people who might be interested. And I think it also requires, you got to be able to show the connection with evidence. A lot of people want to say there were these meetings, these spooky meetings that might belong in an X-Files episode. But unless you can prove that every person that you said was there and that's what they were talking about, then you don't have that definitive proof we need for a smoking gun.
But you lean towards that it was a retaliatory thing as a result of Bay of Pigs? I mean,
I think that...
me looking back at it, I kind of think, and I'm not, I don't study it as much as you and Chuck do, but it was a combination of things, which it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so you had a lot of pissed off people in certain key places that saw mutual outcomes for their personal invested interests.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's also, we have to, because a lot of people want to automatically use, let's say, for instance, Allen Dulles. A lot of people want to point the blame at Dulles as being head of the CIA and that JFK fired him over the Bay of Pigs. And then that should be, and that's just the case. It was Dulles. But, they don't consider that if you look at the private correspondence between JFK and Dulles, that it was very amicable, and that Dulles also, in a private note that I came across recently, I'll be putting in my next book, is that Dulles offered to quit after the Bay of Pigs. And that's never discussed. Right. And it's, this was said by, some people will say, well, it's a person who worked for the CIA. It was Lyman Kirkpatrick, who was the inspector general at the time. But Kirkpatrick didn't have a reason to lie about that. That was actually normal policy in the past. When a political leader does something and it basically gets trounced in the public, that leader usually goes away, no matter what organization they had. Mm-hmm. So I don't think I don't think Dulles was going to throw away his life of being wealthy and influential for the chance that Kennedy could be killed. Because as we know, there was a miss. Mm-hmm. So that means that it wasn't a perfect assassin up there firing, that he could have hit anybody else. And is someone like Allen Dulles going to gamble everything on the chance that it might succeed and then face the consequences if it didn't?
Yeah, but you don't believe Oswald pulled the trigger, obviously.
No. I think the problem with Oswald pulling the trigger can basically be summed up in, one, there is no verifiable evidence that he ever practiced with the Carcano between the time he ordered the Carcano and the time of the assassination. On my website, I actually have a thing called the Improbability Vault, where I try to put the most improbable things from both sides of, official supporters and conspiracy advocates there for people to look at with evidence to show why I don't think it could have happened the way that people are trying to propose to the public it did. And one of them is called the Oswald timeline myth. And I go through a lot of his final hours. I think something that most people don't know is that Lee Harvey Oswald, the government always gave him lots of time to develop a motive they never established, and tried to use his time in Mexico City and elsewhere as being conclusive to point towards a plot with Kennedy. The problem is that the Secret Service didn't really, if Oswald is a lone gunman, as the government claims, the Secret Service didn't release the parade route until the 18th, and it wasn't in the newspaper until the 19th. Mm-hmm. So Lee Harvey Oswald has less than 72 hours to develop a motive, plan a plot, practice, which he never does, and make everything happen as it did. And that's just highly improbable. I mean, think about it. Anyone should think about it themselves. If they wanted to take out a political figure, and this isn't even 72 hours he's got whole, because you have to subtract 8 hours a day for work, 8 hours a day for sleep. So he has roughly about less than 30 hours incrementally over 3 days to get everything done without making a major mistake.
Right. So that didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Yeah, that's highly improbable.
All right. And since most people who are going to listen to me, most of them probably, are too young to even, know anything about Kennedy. And they're out there looking on Google and YouTube, getting little bits of information. So let me ask you this question. The speculation that the Secret Service knew, and if you watch, the Zapruder film, as they're turning the corner and the social security, Jesus, the Secret Service back off. What's your take on that? What is it? What did that look like to you, and what conclusions would you draw from that type of footage?
I personally, because I went and found the documents, the statements of the Secret Service. First of all, I think that people should have been fired and someone should have been punished. And that didn't happen. Rowley, who was the head of the Secret Service, actually put in a statement to the Warren Commission that he wanted to spare them the embarrassment or the eternal, branding that they were the reason that JFK died. So that I understand to an extent, but I still think someone should have been punished.
So, do you think they were in on it?
I don't think they were in on it because another factor is they were up partying the night before. Most of the Secret Service was up partying, and at least 4 members of them, which the evidence also shows, I believe was Reddy, Clint Hill, and 2 others were drinking the night before. So they were up late, drinking whiskey, then they went to an after-hours bar, and then they got, 2 hours of sleep before Kennedy hit the ground?
So it was just an amazing coincidence that...
Well, I don't think it was a coincidence, but I think that they were confused, hungover.
And it just happened. Yeah, and it just happened to be when Kennedy was getting assassinated.
When he needed the most.
Yeah, and hey, that happens.
Yeah, and I just think that's a lot more, because the thing is if you want to try to include the entire Secret Service, there's over a dozen agents. Mm-hmm. So, you're starting to get into really big numbers, and then that's just the Secret Service. So then what about the shooter? And then what about the conspirators? And then what about, any support they required? So you're getting in, it's just too big.
Okay. Now, what's your take on Lyndon B Johnson's role with all of it? There are some people who come to the conclusion he was the puppet master. Things like the red carpet in the Oval Office, and I've heard stories of the vice president's oath of office being in his pocket, on Air Force One. What's your take on Lyndon B Johnson's role?
I would tell people to look for his private moments rather than the overt public moments people try to paint as guilt. With Johnson, he's a villain. I have no doubt. He's a political villain, and he's a scumbag. He was definitely someone who took advantage of any political opportunity he could have, and notably people have shown that, he might have cheated in a few elections that he participated in. Now, that aside, I don't think that means you're a murderer if you're a dishonest politician. That's pretty standard. Now, I don't think that Johnson had a direct hand in it, because if we look at some of the private, conversations that Johnson had, one was with Hoover, where he inquired if any of the bullets were aimed at him. And another was when he was on Air Force One, he was talking to General McHugh, and he was crying in the bathroom of the airplane, saying that he thought it was a conspiracy and thought that he'd be next.
Okay, not that Kennedy had gotten his head blown off, but...
Well, exactly. But, even that self-interest, of course, being
makes
Johnson...
Makes him an asshole. Makes him an asshole, not a killer.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I think that, it definitely leans more towards that than him being a killer. And what did he essentially inherit? He got a less than, just over a year of a shadow presidency where people were already blaming him the day after it happened, even though there was no proof of that. Mm-hmm. And then he got to inherit all of the problems of desegregation, the Vietnam War. If he wanted to be president, he could have just ran. And if you notice, he chose not to run after he had such a disastrous first term.
Mm-hmm. All right, magic bullet.
I find that highly improbable. And that's due to quite a few reasons. I'd say one is we don't know the amount of shrapnel left over. That has always been a consideration that I think some people dismiss, is that Connolly died with shrapnel in his leg still, Kennedy died with shrapnel in his brain still. So all that shrapnel has to be accounted for. And I would contend that all that shrapnel alone might be bigger than the amount missing from the magic bullet. Then you have to consider, what state were other bullets in when they were fired in similar tests. How could a nearly pristine, I wouldn't say totally pristine, and we do know that it was actually, a piece was cut out by officials when they were trying to test it, so that wasn't damage from the firing, that was damage from them cutting it out. So this nearly pristine projectile somehow inflicted all those wounds in Connolly and Kennedy, and it came out looking like that. I just think that is scientifically unfeasible. And if you look, even the doctors who would in time agree with the official case said that they didn't think the bullet was the same bullet. Dr. Fink and Dr. Dr. Fink and Dr. Humes, both in testimony to the commission, even though they supported the official, findings that Oswald was the lone shooter, they did not support that projectile could have done what it was claimed to have done and remained in that state. It would have been more deformed. It would have had problems. It's just based on physics and on medical science. It's very difficult for me to accept that is the bullet. And we don't even know where the bullet came from. Some people in, official groups have claimed that it came from Connolly's stretcher. And the Warren Commission itself actually had a private meeting when they were in executive session debating about that fact, that they can't really state 100% the definitive provenance of that bullet.
All right. Now, the images that we've seen of Kennedy's head with a bullet wound, and then I guess after he's transported on Air Force One to D.C., that it appeared somebody took a buck knife and mutilated the wound. What do you have to say about that? And is that just internet chatter? What's up with that?
Well, I've heard of manipulation of the wound. I haven't seen any definitive evidence of it. I do know that mistakes definitely were made, repeated mistakes. I mean, we have, but for instance, like the people who want to try to blame Johnson often state that that Johnson ordered that Kennedy's body be taken away to try to escape before they could actually, make any sort of medical determination in Dallas. And he ordered that, he be sworn in before he got on the plane so that he could secure power. But what's actually revealed is, in some other research, John McCone, who was at the time the head of the CIA, was actually with Robert Kennedy and was consulting with him about, what arrangements should be made. And he suggested to Robert Kennedy that Johnson be sworn in there, and Robert Kennedy agreed so that the country wouldn't have to not have a president for 2.5 hours while Johnson was in the air. And McCone also suggested to Robert Kennedy that the body be brought up to save Robert Kennedy a trip down to Dallas to just have to fly back with the body. And, this was in his private diary. So we didn't have access. I think that's another big thing, too, is I think a lot of people are believing old stories that were crafted by officials and by conspiracy advocates long before anybody had as much access to the evidence. That might be the reason why progress can be made more in our time, is that we've actually got more evidence to look at now.
Okay, to debunk conspiracy.
Yeah, well,
sides.
Exactly. It's and I try to tell people, because some people get angry when I offer evidence that shows that they're wrong, but, we all can be wrong. And the only way to ever come to some sort of consensus is to start removing things from the table. You can't have a table full of trash with valuables under the trash.
Yeah. Well, I like to say I don't believe in marriage, especially marriage to ideas.
Exactly.
All it does is cause pride whenever something comes out that conflicts what you believe, and then ego gets into it, and then emotionalism. But when you're really seeking the truth, man, you're not married to any particular theory. It's probably propping up some other beliefs you have.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. So, Bobby Kennedy. Why they do that?
Well, in that one, I actually, because JFK is such an expansive case, it's definitely harder to nail down who the possibilities are for people who could have been behind it. With Robert Kennedy, I think there are definitely still multiple groups that might want to do something to him, but the ones who had access, I think the biggest thing is with Robert Kennedy, unlike JFK and MLK, there are medical facts that officials actually released that are in their reports that refute the official claim of Sirhan Sirhan. The biggest problem is that Sirhan Sirhan is based on, I'd say, 80 to 90% of all the witness testimony over roughly 3 feet or more away from Robert Kennedy, in front of him, firing when Kennedy is assassinated. Now, the problem is that Kennedy was shot 3 times, once in the back of the ear, once in the back, and once in the shoulder, and then once lower down on the back. So you have 3 wounds from the back,
right,
with the gunman 3 feet in front of him. Now people are trying to, it's a problem. People are trying. A little bit of
physics not working out there.
Yeah, and people tried to twist him and change him and say as the shot hit, he turned this way and that. Well, that didn't happen. We have that based on the testimony, he wasn't twisting and turning. It's just an impossibility. The biggest impossibility of that is the third shot, the one delivered to the back of his head by the ear, left a stippling mark. So there was a powder burn on him. Now that only occurs if you're within 2 inches or less to your target. So the shot that killed him came from behind.
Mhm.
and was up close, 2 inches or less, a place Sirhan never was. So not to say that Sirhan isn't guilty of multiple attempted murder charges for shooting the other 5 victims and shooting at Kennedy. And one of the bullets actually did strike Kennedy's shoulder pad from the front. That can be shown through ballistics. But the other 3 shots are unexplained, and Sirhan can't fire them. So that necessitates another person to be there.
Okay, so conspiracy. But
Mm-hmm.
what was the motive?
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, to go back to that, I think the motive is to prevent anything like the first Kennedy presidency.
Mm-hmm. Okay. MLK.
Well, MLK is, I think, that as some people might know, in 1999, his family got a judgment that supports that a conspiracy did occur. And unfortunately, some of the circumstances presented weren't necessarily accurate as later research was done. We found that everything that William F. Pepper gave in support of the conspiracy wasn't verified. So I think you actually have sort of an opposite you have, for instance, in the beginning, when the government wanted to take James Earl Ray and make him their guilty man, you basically had, in my opinion, a railroading of James Earl Ray through the legal system, and various attorneys of his were fired or quit because they were trying to financially enrich themselves on the infamy that Ray had gotten. And Ray was convinced by his first attorney to enter a guilty plea, thinking that he'd get a lesser sentence, and instead he was just labeled the lone gunman and then put away, never to be released. Now, same thing basically with Sirhan will happen if things aren't addressed and the government doesn't start to realize that there are more facts than they initially thought. And I think that King was killed definitely because they were afraid. I would say with King, I'd lean more towards possible militants doing it. Larry Hancock and Stu Wexler did a really good book called The Awful Grace of God that talks about some of the militant groups that were going around. And there was actually a floating contract on King.
Really?
Yeah, that some militant groups had said that they would donate so much money if someone wanted to kill King.
What type of militant groups?
The White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, various branches of the Klan that had gotten destroyed by... What happened was basically in the 50s and 60s, Hoover, among the many illegal things he did, this one actually was perhaps a good thing, was that he basically set about destroying the Klan.
Uh-huh.
And he used all the powers he was given by law and many that weren't, like eavesdropping and using informants with inside the Klan to turn the Klan against itself. And what happened was it broke up in all these mini groups. Mm-hmm. So there was like the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and the First Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and the Old Order of the Ku Klux Klan. So all these different groups all wanted to stop King. I think the biggest threat with King was he had gotten civil rights protections passed. He had gotten the Voting Rights Acts passed. And they thought he was going to keep going, which he would have. Mm-hmm. But then he started to oppose the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And I think that might have given a lot more impetus to people to stop him. Because there was a lot of money made for some people in the Vietnam War.
Oh, of course. Traumatized a whole generation, man. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's kind of obvious what the motive was with MLK.
Yeah.
Do you think? And when I don't really keep up with it, but what year are they supposed to release all the documents? Is it 2072 or something like that? I don't even know.
Well, originally there was supposed to be a big release years ago, but it was withheld. Supposedly this year, they're going to release another batch of documents. Some people think all the remaining documents should be out, and I agree they should, but I'm not so hopeful. And I think that there's a lot of information that people overlook that we already have. I think a big problem is that there are millions of online files in various repositories, and I mean, no one person has read everything. Right. So until we get... it sounds perhaps too hopeful, but I'm hoping one day that I can meet enough people who are willing to, not only go in for the things they're interested in, but basically assign certain file sets to different people so we can get through them and actually come back and then discuss what we found so that we can get a better picture of everything.
Right. Well, do you think that we'll ever know all the truth, or will we always have to speculate on certain things, or do you think that there is a day where we're going to know for sure everything that we need to know?
I hope it's within our lifetimes. Yeah. Because a lot of people have already gone to the grave as far as JFK without ever having, any definite answers, and I don't see that. If anything, the government has learned not to release things. So I don't think there's ever going to be a day until after many people who are alive during 9/11 are gone that they're ever going to release everything on 9/11. And, like I said, Chuck told people to learn from the mistakes. It's because there's been so much, unfortunately, the JFK case, I think one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of the big answers is because of the infighting. There's a lot of people who are more interested in promoting themselves than promoting any sort of progress. And it's easy to not get along with some people in the case. They don't make it easy for you to get along with them. But I think we have to try. There's always going to be people that don't, as Chuck has mentioned, my extensive Facebook block list. There's always going to be people who we're not going to get along with.
Yeah.
And who will make other accounts to try to come at us again.
Yeah. Me and him have been through that whole gauntlet too with different topics, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. It's unfortunately cost of doing business these days.
Yeah. Some people don't like to play pretty.
Yeah, exactly. When, and my whole thing is that, and that unfortunately I think has, even in the old days before the internet, you had people on mailing lists writing bad stuff about each other.
Yeah.
So it's, the technology catches up. There's always going to be those people who want to just argue and debate. They don't want to actually come to any sort of consensus.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So you don't see any of the people who were directly involved ever being brought to justice in our lifetimes?
Well, if they are alive, I should say. Maybe it's possible, but I think it's more of a historical necessity. Mm-hmm. I think that history does judge you no matter what. So even if they're not alive, their names should go down in the history books as having been responsible, no matter how long it takes.
I agree 100%. So do you kind of looking at what's going on here in the country now, what are your thoughts on Trump and I don't really give a shit. I used to be a big political activist. I was a Ron Paul guy, and then I saw that movement get corrupted too, mm-hmm. to where right now, whenever I heard that Trump was a front runner, not the front runner, but a front runner, I made a deliberate decision to stop paying attention to politics because at that point you come to the realization that it's just a game show, and I become very George Carlin-esque in my view. So to me, it's just another channel to watch if you're bored. But what are your thoughts? You think it's just talk about it, because I don't know.
Yeah, well, I too have kept myself largely from interacting. I've resisted all of, maybe I'll say it here so hopefully you and your listeners can get a laugh. But my question is when is Nixon going to take off the Trump mask? But I do. I see Trump as sort of like a cross between Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
He's
I think the best description I've heard of him came from Penn Jillette. It was that he's Uncle Scrooge from DuckTales.
There you go. That doesn't seem outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah, it's a cartoon. And,
the question.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, the question is when is he going to bring out Huey, Dewey, and Louie?
Yeah, and I find it funny that Disney's actually rebooting this show. But just after his inauguration speech, all this crap on social media from different aspects, it was just the hilarity of it. There were all these videos about comparing him to Bane from The Dark Knight Rises, which I think is fantastic, and then the liberal women screaming no, and then the mashups and the mixes, and then these people walking down the streets dressed up like vaginas, and Madonna's gonna blow up the White House, and it's just Bush is behind Trump making a complete idiot out of himself with a poncho, and I'm like, did I smoke too much weed, or is this actually, is this actually the country that has a fucking military? I mean, honestly, we have the world's biggest military at our disposal. I'm suddenly not comfortable with this idea.
Yeah, I think that definitely, I mean, with the Chinese say it's a curse to live in interesting times. And we do live in interesting times. I think that it's going to be a day by day situation, and I think that a lot of people on both sides, unfortunately, are really heavy into the hyperbole, and not actually, that we're all going to have to, whether we like it or not, somehow get behind this guy. I'm not talking about like support him, but at least not make every day a protest,
Uh-huh.
because we need to accept, for instance, this is the same thing that the Republicans did when Obama became president.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what the liberals and the left want to do? Or do they want to alienate their fellow Americans? Do they want to alienate their government based on one guy?
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, Trump is a figurehead,
Mm-hmm.
just like Obama was, just like Bush was, just like every president largely in our lifetimes has been, a mere figurehead. So they support the interests that help put them there.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't necessarily, the commander-in-chief's a great title and everything, but the commander-in-chief doesn't make many decisions on his own. He calls in the cabinet, he calls in Secretary of State. This isn't one guy. He is just the face for what some people think is wrong. And personally, I think that it's funny that people talk about, wanting to be violent and wanting to destroy him, and then at the same time want to call themselves the forces of inclusion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you want to include the people you want to include. I think there's a lot of hypocrisy to go around.
Right. Right. All right. And because the internet is rife with it, what is your take regarding the Kennedy assassinations, MLK, and what's going on now with politics in our country? What's your take on Freemasons, Illuminati, all that good stuff, or do you go there?
I usually stay away from that stuff.
Okay.
Personally, I mean, I've come across, the Rothschilds and the Bilderberg group and the Vanderbilts in history, and I think that people are trying to make something perhaps more out of it than it truly is.
Mm-hmm.
Men have always been greedy.
Mm-hmm.
Men in power have always worked in the interest of their own benefit, and they will work together to do so too. So I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that there are, old money families colluding to keep themselves in power and keep themselves financially stable. But I don't think that once again, the conspiracy is too big.
Well,
When it starts to get into dozens and dozens of people, just imagine the logistics required
yeah.
to secretly communicate between that many people.
Well, Carmine, when I first got into doing alternative research, obviously you run into, it's a conspiracy by the banking elite, and it's all this stuff, and maybe so. But then I got into politics myself at City Hall,
Hmm.
and I watched these local locals. City Hall. The City Hall meeting is held, I think, I don't know, every Tuesday or something, and it's broadcast out on the public networks and whatnot. And you can go, you could watch your city council members and your mayor and your chief of police talk, and pass all these, and everything is smiley and happy. But when you actually go down to City Hall, you find out that meeting that's in front of the cameras at say 6 p.m. is actually just an act, because you actually have to be there at 4 p.m. in the upper room where it's not so pretty and it's not so happy and it's not so smiley. And then, that weekend you go to your local restaurant in this little town and you see all of these cats eating dinner together with like a new developer for a water park. And you go, shit, the conspiracy isn't that there is a few elite people who are passing legislation and doing things to make a lot of money. The conspiracy is that most people don't realize that shit happens from the top, the highest level, all the way down to your local city council.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
the
I
fucking
agree.
conspiracy.
Yeah. Yeah. The big secret is that they're all working together to benefit themselves at the cost of the public.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can't, and you always hear in alternative research, they, the them, who the fuck are, let me tell you who they is. Go to your restroom, look in the mirror, and
Yeah.
ask yourself, when did you go down to City Hall last at your local level?
Yeah.
And
The
have
av-
your
yeah the
voice
average
heard.
the average person isn't. It's easier, and I wouldn't say all people do this, but I'd say there's a number of them, to blame it on some sort of amorphous conspiracy rather than to take the responsibility that you are part of a corrupt system.
Yeah.
And it's easier to ignore that system than to actually try to be proactive and go out and change it.
Yeah, I'm a personal liberty guy, and that means that if there's something that I don't like, I'm not supposed to just bitch about it. Yeah, I'm supposed to be a watchman on the wall. But ultimately, if if I go through my town and I say, hey guys, they're putting chemicals in our drinking water, let's go do something, and then I sit at the house and assume that they're all going to go, and then I don't go, then I'm the bad guy. I had the knowledge, I had the ability to do something about it, and I didn't. And that's just the way that I look at it. Uh, so, in my opinion, it's easier for this generation to say we're facing a huge gargantuan machine that is so well financed we'll never win. Like it's a huge fight. But I believe that it doesn't really have to be a huge fight. It just we can fix it all if we do it first within ourselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't
No,
have. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, I definitely agree that we all have to take some personal responsibility. But I also think that, it's like I was telling you about when I and Chuck were discussing, what I consider to be, for instance, like I'm sure you've seen in media in a few places some of these fake hate crimes that happened shortly after Trump was elected.
Mm-mm.
Oh, you didn't? I'll have to send you. Basically, there was a woman in New Orleans, or not New Orleans, but I think outside in Louisiana, who claimed that two white men with a man wearing a Trump hat attacked her and ripped off her hijab, her headdress,
Mm-hmm.
and claimed "Go Trump" or whatever, and that turned out to be false. There was a woman who was a college student who was trying to get out of being late for her curfew at home in New York, who said that two white men, one wearing a Trump hat, attacked her and made racist comments and tried to rip her hijab off, which didn't happen.
Yeah.
So I think unfortunately, and then the third one was I don't know, this is probably maybe 6 months or more ago, but that church in Mississippi that got burned down during the election.
Mm-hmm.
There was a church in Mississippi that got burned down, and spray painted on the side was "Vote Trump," and of course it was labeled a hate crime, and this was assumed to be someone who supported Trump. Well, it turns out it was one of the parishioners of the church who was a black gentleman, and he did it probably just to inspire anti-Trump rhetoric.
Jeez.
So I'm not saying that that's the majority of cases, and I'm sure there are legitimate cases where people have been violent over politics, but that I think goes to a new low in our politics. Now there are actually people trying to incite violence, trying to incite racial hatred
Mm-hmm.
beyond just what normally occurs.
Why? I mean, we live in 2017. People should get off the race thing. To me, that's mind-boggling.
Well, my whole thing is that, I mean, if you want to get technical, there's only one race, the human race.
Yeah.
Homo sapien sapien. It's just different cultures you don't like.
That's exactly. That's what I've been said. No, man. There are distinct cultural differences between, say, me, a Irish guy, and a black guy.
Yeah.
Rather than looking for what is shocking to your cultural senses, why don't you examine that culture and find things that you appreciate about that culture?
Yeah, and every culture is going to have good and bad parts to it.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean we should be on that show where I was telling you that I talked. One of the things I talked about were the forgotten words of Martin Luther King, and everybody acts like they've read his "I Have a Dream" speech and they commit it to their hearts. But when you see liberal or conservative people judging others based on the content of their skin, whether their skin is black or white, not on the content of their character,
or orange,
orange or yellow, or or brown, but it applies to everyone. And I think people forgot that. Dr. King had a universal message of acceptance, not, well, white men are not considered in vogue right now, so white men are the enemy. Because Donald Trump's white, all white people are responsible, which is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of white people voted against him, but that isn't an impetus to hate someone just because they're different. If you hate someone, what was it? King said that an agenda of black supremacy is just as evil as an agenda of white supremacy.
Oh, sure. Me personally, I love all music. I don't care. Music is music. It's great. And I love hip-hop. One of my favorite hip-hop artists is Lil Wayne. And I love it to death, the fact that somebody so prominent and as talented as he is goes on BET and says racism doesn't exist. And then, all these people are trying to shit on him.
Yeah.
But it was great. He's like, look, man, when I was a kid, I shot myself, and it was a bunch of black cops that stepped over my body. It was a white dude that got me to the hospital. He said, so I don't know racism. And, BET they lost their shit.
Yeah, because that's a talking point.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of their big talking points. And some people make their entire fortunes out of divisiveness,
Oh,
out
yeah.
of keeping the public separated and hating one another. You know, the old saying that I've heard from various people about, uh, what is it? The golden rule is that he who has the gold makes the rules.
Mm-hmm.
That's the golden rule. And that is a pretty accurate, pretty accurate adage, because unfortunately, a lot of the things in our lives that we care about are dominated by money and influence.
Yeah, it's a fact.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, and hopefully it'll change one day. But to say that certain people aren't doing certain things to incite us, for instance, one from each side, Ann Coulter and Al Franken,
Oh God.
they both have made livings, and they both Franken's in the Congress based
Mm-hmm.
on some of the hyperbolic things he likes to say about conservatives,
A
and
shtick.
yeah. And Ann Coulter, even worse. She'll say absolutely anything just to get people going, and she knows what she's doing.
Yeah, of course she does. She can't be that fucking stupid.
No one is that unself-aware.
No, yeah, and I know vegetables. Okay.
Yeah.
No. So you're working on another book. What's your next book?
Oh, wow! You're the first person to ask. It's going to be years from now. Hopefully I'll get it written soon before the end of the decade. But it's going to be a sequel. It's going to be another book on JFK, MLK, and RFK. But this time I'm going to try to shoot for more intermediate and advanced files.
Mm-hmm.
Some more new stuff that I'm going to take a few years to dig up and try to give everybody. I'm going to probably call it Two Princes and a King further into the files. But basically, the first book is a launching point so everybody can get familiar. I try to give them all the basics and some new information that I found. And then this one is to build upon that and then offer some of the alternate. Like, for instance, in the first book I put, I believe, 4 or 5 different scenarios of how it could have occurred: a mafia plot, a Cuban exile plot, a minute plot that would include Oswald, not as a shooter, but include him as the patsy, and with just one conspirator and 2 other gunmen. And then I talked about a conglomerate plot of all 3 of those. And this one, I'm probably going to do a conglomerate plot with some other people, but I'm also going to go into a possible militant plot. I'm going to go into a possible foreign plot. Just try to, cover all of the bases so people can get not just a general understanding, but a deeper understanding as, the next book comes.
Where can people get Two Princes and a King?
They can get it on Amazon, and I have links at tpac.com to Amazon, or CreateSpace is another place they can get. If you want the text version, CreateSpace. Amazon is both. But yeah, and they can find me, Two Princes and a King, TPOC page and author page on Facebook, on Google Plus, on StumbleUpon, and on Twitter.
All right, and did you go with a traditional? I'm asking because I'm an author and an editor, and I'm building a publishing company too.
Okay.
Did you go with traditional publishing, or was it self-published?
Well, I started a company, Neapolis Media Group, and then I published through there.
Okay, all right, cool.
Tried to learn everything myself, and this time around I'm probably going to hire an editor because it'll save me a year.
Dude, that's why I love self-publishing, because I hate editors. I wrote what I wrote. I've already read it and edited it. That's exactly how the fuck I wanted it to be read. Okay, no, I don't want a comma there. I just specific. I don't care what Merriam-Webster's fucking says. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I'm so happy that I could write now in the digital age and not have to worry about no editor.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of good and bad about editors from various people. If you get the wrong one, they can definitely screw up your project and make it take a lot longer than it needs to.
Yeah, especially if they're editors. Fucking, we need to lump them in there with lawyers and tax collectors, man.
Nice.
Fucking editors.
Downloaded content podcast. Download content.